probably one of the most popular mythological creatures ever. I mean, they're everywhere, all over pop culture, whether they be wise, magical ancient beasts, or just mindless animals, or rare, tasty creatures. Dragons are pretty much an enduring symbol of strength and wonder and the unknown, even. I mean, pretty much everybody talks about dragons. Everybody knows about dragons. Fantasy writers use dragons all the time. I mean, an aspiring fantasy writer in, say, middle school may write a story about dragons and share it with some people, and they start taunting him about it, and they all laugh. They make fun of him. They call him Dragon Boy. But I'm not Dragon Boy. I'll have my revenge. Oh yes, they will rue a day. I'll have my revenge. So let's talk about dragons.
A dragon, I swear I saw a dragon. A green and seething, fire-breathing monster is in sight, with eyes of red, a lion's head, and wings as dark as night. Oh, he has a jaw of gleaming teeth, he's 50 feet in height.
Of course, we all know what dragons are, but where did they come from? The word dragon is derived from the Greek drakon, meaning a large serpent. This is what the dragon started out as, a large snake. Greek mythology contains a number of references to dragons. For example, a dragon guarded the Golden Fleece in the tale of Jason and the Argonauts. And that same story claims that planting dragon's teeth like seeds causes warriors to grow out of the ground. Other serpentine creatures from Greek myth, such as the Hydra from the legend of the 12 labors of Heracles, that's Hercules if you're using the Roman names, were considered dragons. According to the story, the Hydra was a venomous snake with 9 heads, and whenever one head was chopped off, 3 more grew back in its place. Heracles defeated the Hydra by using a torch to cauterize the neck stumps before more heads could grow, allowing him to decapitate the Hydra willy-nilly without worrying about increasing its number of heads. But in the end, it was the Hydra who had the last laugh. You see, Heracles used the venom of the Hydra's blood for his arrow tips, and the centaur, Nessus, was killed by one of these poisoned arrows. With his dying breath, Nessus told Heracles' wife to dip a tunic in his blood, and this tunic would, when worn, bring Heracles great fortune. But when Heracles lit a funeral pyre while wearing the tunic, his sweat mixed with the poisoned blood, allowing the venom to enter into him, killing the Greek hero. With the story of the Hydra, we can really see the earliest and simplest explanation for the dragon legend: our own natural fear of snakes. Why shouldn't humans fear snakes? They crawl on their bellies without limbs, and their fangs carry venom that can kill us if we are bitten. Snakes represent evil in many cultures, the most well-known example perhaps being the serpent who tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. But other evil snakes appear in other mythologies as well. In Norse mythology, one of Loki's children was Jormungand, also called the Midgard serpent. Jormungand was a snake so large, so huge, that it wrapped itself around the human world of Midgard and laid in the oceans, awaiting the end times. It was prophesied that during the end of the world, what the Norse called Ragnarok, Jormungand would arise from the ocean and battle the thunder god Thor. Thor would ultimately be victorious in battle, but afterwards he would succumb to the venom of Jormungand's fangs and die. As dragons arise from the tradition of evil and dangerous serpents in Western myth, it is rather inaccurate to describe Eastern dragons as, well, dragons. Even though both are serpents, the dragons of East Asian folklore, known as Longs in China, were benevolent and wise spirits of water. The only reason they are truly called dragons in the first place is because Western explorers to the east picked up on the superficial differences and identified them as such. As for European dragons, it is difficult to pinpoint when exactly the most common characteristics of Western dragons actually arose in their depiction. It is likely that their shapes changed over time as a result of ancient peoples stumbling across dinosaur bones and needing explanations for such. But no real evidence exists to support this. we can only speculate. Of course, the most commonly accepted trait of the dragon in modern mythology is its ability to breathe fire. It's not particularly difficult to see how this arose from the ancient serpentine dragons. Poison, infection, venom, etc. are commonly associated with flame. Wounds that are infected or poisoned are even called inflamed in contemporary English. The sensation of having a poisoned or infected wound is similar to suffering from a burn, and so this connection to fire naturally arose. Eventually, the dragon went from having a venomous bite to having the ability to breathe flames from its mouth. It was during the Middle Ages that dragons began to be depicted with legs and wings, likely to emphasize their believed connection to the devil, as the dragon was a serpentine, fiery beast that brought destruction in its wake. It made for an easy symbol for the ultimate evil in Christian lore. The Revelation of St. John, also simply called the Book of Revelations, is the final book of the New Testament. It is a heavily symbolic critique of the Roman Empire and its persecution of early Christians, using the apocalypse to frame a story about the downfall of Rome. In Revelations, the devil is represented by a 7-headed dragon who hunts for the Virgin Mary. This, more than anything, probably led to the conflation of dragons with the devil, since, as time went on and the Roman persecution ended under Emperor Constantine, people began interpreting Revelations as a more literal prophecy about the end of the world. Of course, the most famous Christian tale regarding dragons is the legend of St. George. St. George was a knight who one day came across a village that was being terrorized by a dragon. In order to prevent the dragon from destroying the town, the villagers offered maidens as sacrifice to appease it. St. George, of course, rode forth, saved the maiden, and killed the dragon. This is a pretty common motif when it comes to dragon stories. In fact, it's almost bizarrely widespread. The whole princess and dragon motif repeats itself constantly throughout world mythologies. Perseus and Andromeda is an even earlier example, as the Greek hero Perseus rescued the maiden Andromeda from being sacrificed to a sea serpent. But it's even more widespread than that. The Japanese legend of the 8-headed serpent Yamata no Orochi, which, by the way, has a great depiction in the awesome game Okami, uses a similar principle, despite the fact that, you'll note, Britain and Japan are nowhere near each other. In the Japanese tale, Susanoo was a god who was exiled from the heavens. As he traveled Japan, he came across an old couple weeping in despair, for they once had 8 daughters, but each year one was devoured by the 8-headed serpent Yamata no Orochi. Now only their final daughter, Kushinada, remained. Susanoo offered to rid them of the serpent in exchange for Kushinada's hand in marriage. He then hid the maiden and prepared a great banquet of sake for the same. When Yamata no Orochi arrived, it was intrigued by the sake and drank it all up, and so Susanoo was able to slay the great beast while it was in a drunken stupor. What a way to go. In the modern world, dragons have been regulated to fantasy, and, like most fantasy creatures, the modern interpretation owes much to Tolkien. The Dragon Smaug from J.R.R. Tolkien's novel The Hobbit pretty much codified everything we think of when we think of dragons today. A massive, fire-breathing winged beast sitting in a cave, guarding a hoard of treasure with tough scales that protect it from harm. It takes flight to attack a nearby town and is killed by an archer who pierces the one part of its body not protected by a scale. Of course, Tolkien drew from English and Scandinavian legends to create his fantasy world, and Smaug has origins in Norse mythology. One of Tolkien's greatest influences is the Norse tale of the Ring of Nebula, also called the Ring Cycle, which was not truly technically a legend from Norse mythology, but rather it was Richard Wagner's operatic adaptation of it. One of the stories in the Ring Cycle tells of Fafnir, a man who, in his greed, slew his own father to obtain his hoard of gold, which his father had been given as a gift from Odin Allfather, the king of the gods. In order to protect his hoard, Fafnir transformed himself into a dragon, and was ultimately slain by the Norse warrior named, depending on your translation, either Siegfried or Sigurd. The dragon guarding a hoard of treasure seems to be derived almost entirely from Scandinavian legends, actually. Aside from the legend of Fafnir, the epic poem Beowulf also features a dragon who guards a hoard of treasure. Because Tolkien depicted Smaug with the ability to speak, many subsequent writers have portrayed dragons as old and wise creatures, far wiser than us mere humans. In fact, nowadays it's fairly common in fantasy stories to see dragons who are ancient and wise beings. Other writers draw a line between dragons and similar creatures called wyverns. The main difference is that dragons are depicted with 4 legs and 2 wings, whereas wyverns have 2 wings and only 2 legs. Though, interestingly, even in works which depict dragons as intelligent, wise, and noble creatures, wyverns are rarely anything more than simple animals.
So basically, dragons are diverse and vaguely defined creatures. But yet, everybody knows what they are. Yeah. Don't know what else to say, but... shit.
A dragon, I swear I saw a dragon. A green and seething, fire-breathing monster is in sight, with eyes of red, a lion's head, and wings as dark as night. Oh, he has a jaw of gleaming teeth, he's 50 feet in height. It's true, oh, what are we to do? It's true, he'll break us all in two. Oh, he's coming in, his great big fin is right against the door. So board up all the windows and get down on the floor.
Has anybody seen my dad?
Please, my child, come in. Get off that street.
What's the matter?
Worst thing I ever saw in my life out there in the street.
What was it?
Oh, I don't want to tell you for fear it'll scare you to death.